Good morning, happy Lunar New Year, and thank you for joining EPIC for an insider's look at COP26, successes, setbacks, and the future of international climate diplomacy. My name is Jeffrey Sun. I am a third year at the University of Chicago majoring in fundamentals, issues, and texts. My hometown is Mendham, New Jersey. I'm also a project leader in the Phoenix Sustainability Initiative. We are a registered student organization on campus that develops and implements sustainable practices at the university, in Hyde Park, and on the city level. We're also engaged in intercollegiate organizations which collaborate on environmental issues. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Sue Binyaz is Deputy to Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. Throughout her more than 25 years of service as a climate leader within the US government, Sue Binyaz has played a central role in all major international climate negotiations, including the Paris Agreement and the latest COP26 talks. During her tenure at the US State Department, she also supervised the Treaty Office and issues related to law of the sea, Somali piracy, the Western Hemisphere, human rights, law enforcement, and private international law. Prior to that, she led the State Department's Legal Office for Oceans, Environment, and Science, as well as the Legal Office for European Affairs. Today's conversation will be moderated by Lisa Friedman, a New York Times climate reporter focused on climate and environmental policy. Throughout her career, she has covered 8 international climate talks. While working previously for Climate Wire, she led a team of 12 reporters focused on the business and politics of the changing climate. Before Climate Wire, Lisa Friedman was the Washington bureau chief for the Oakland Tribune and later the Los Angeles Daily News. She will lead the discussion before opening to your questions. Thank you all again for being with us today. Ms. Friedman, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And I'm so honored to be interviewing Sue and having this virtual fireside chat. So I've actually covered 10 of these UN negotiations now. And when I started covering them in the Obama administration, actually end of Bush, Poznan, when you cover a lot of these, as I'm sure Sue will tell you, you start to think of them by city, not year. But over the years, you learn that these big negotiations invariably end in a last minute huddle. And in those late night, 2 days into overtime, wee hours of the morning huddles, there's a bunch of men in suits. And in the middle of that huddle is a woman with her hair pulled back in a bun and glasses. And if you don't know, now you know that she is the one who is the brains of the whole operation. So I'm really honored to be having this discussion. Sue, welcome, and thanks for being here with us. I was hoping we could start with Glasgow. 6 years after the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, countries met last year to ratchet up their commitment. What, now several months after that it's gelled, what do you think were the biggest, 1 or 2 accomplishments out of COP26?
Well, first, thank you for having me, EPIC, and thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, Lisa, for that ridiculously generous introduction. You're the best climate reporter in the world, so there's no comparison between us. Okay, let me tell you what I think about COP26. I'll tell you from the US administration's point of view, but I think this is also just like objectively correct. We had 3 objectives going into COP26, and one was to get the world substantially closer to keeping this 1.5 degree limit on climate change or warming within reach, we used to say, or keep it in sight, or keep it on the table, keep it alive. There are many different ways of saying it, but the idea was that in the intervening years since Paris, it's become even clearer that the temperature rise needs to be limited closer to 1.5 than, let's say, 2, or even well below 2. So that was objective number 1. Objective number 2 was to get some kind of decision out of the parties to the Paris Agreement that recognized the importance of keeping 1.5 alive, and also recognize the importance of what we used to call either the decisive or the critical decade of the 2020s and the need to accelerate climate action during that time. And the third was to finish the so-called Paris rulebook. Those are the guidelines that help make the agreement operational. Most of them were done a couple years ago. As you say, I'll say at the Katowice COP, right? I don't even remember what year that was, but by city, it was in Poland. And not everything was done. The market mechanism provisions were not done. Some of the details of the transparency regime were not done on reporting and review, which I think of as like the accountability aspect of the Paris Agreement. So those were important things that needed to be finished up 6 years after Paris. So I would say all three of those objectives were pretty challenging, but all of them were accomplished. The first was, the US for our part, and I'm not saying we're the only ones who worked on this, not at all. Lots of countries made contributions, and the UK as the presidency was also, exercised extreme leadership. But we worked all year on the major economies, because those are the ones who account for about 80% of global emissions. So it was really important to get them to increase their ambition, particularly their targets under the Paris Agreement, their so-called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. And we did that through bilateral engagement, series of joint statements throughout the year with countries like China and Russia and Saudi Arabia and et cetera, et cetera. We did it multilaterally through the Major Economies Forum. We hosted 2 leader-level events, one of which President Biden had promised on the campaign trail to hold within the first 100 days of taking office. So, we did lots of things throughout the course of the year to try to raise ambition, and so did other countries. And I think lots got done, either before or at the COP itself. The second one was the decision. I had a hard time, although I said to anyone who would listen that we needed a strong decision coming out of Glasgow. I was somewhat skeptical inside my own head because of the consensus process that applies to decisions. In other words, not a single country can block the adoption of a decision, right? That's a very tall order because you've got countries, about 200, and they have very different interests, right? Some of them are existentially threatened by climate change itself, and some are existentially threatened by, responses to climate change. And trying to get all of those countries on the same page and agreeing to the same thing is, well, as is very challenging, and that's why we end up with these these huddles at the end of every COP. So I was a little bit skeptical of whether that would work out, but it did, and I think the outcome, the so-called Glasgow Climate Pact, is pretty strong, stronger than I actually anticipated. On the third point, the rulebook did get done, and that was also challenging because it was technically complicated. These transparency tables, I mean, they could explode your head if you were not incredibly steeped in them for the last several years. And they were politically complicated. There were calls to sort of go back to developed countries, should do something different from developing countries, even though that's not what the Paris Agreement said. There were certain outlier countries that had to be sort of brought into the fold. But I think the rulebook ended up in a good place, and I think most people would agree with that observation. So I guess those would be my not so quick observations about COP26.
Oh, that's helpful. And, toward the end of COP26, there was another huddle. There was a big debate over whether the agreement should call for countries to phase out or to phase down, as the language ultimately was, fossil fuels. Give us a little insider view of that, because you, as always, I saw you right in the middle there with Special Envoy Kerry. How did it start? Tell us what you were doing.
Okay, well, let me give you a little context, right, so that people understand like what part of the process was this. This was at the very end, and at the very end, you've got the so-called plenary, meaning everybody's there. It's not like a subgroup or working group or anything. And it's at the final COP plenary is where you get together to adopt the outcome that becomes the final outcome. So the president of the COP, in this case the UK, I mean, they have to be pretty sure or very sure that when they put it, a document up for adoption by everybody, that it's going to go down smoothly, right? Because if you're the president, you really don't want to find out after you call for its adoption that you've got somebody calling for it, calling to block the the adoption to block consensus. So there's generally a lot of milling around on the plenary floor. I'm sure it's very frustrating to the press because they like want the thing to be over, and like, when is this thing going to happen? But what's generally happening is people are running around trying to figure out, is anyone going to block? And during these rumblings, I would say at the end of Glasgow, it became evident that both China and India had a problem with this particular provision of the Glasgow Climate Pact. So,
and let's just back up for a moment and just explain to folks that the provision was calling for nations. It was a clause calling for nations to phase out fossil fuels, to phase out coal.
It was actually less strong than that. I've pulled it up in case anyone is very interested. It's paragraph 36 of the Glasgow Climate Pact. And I'll actually read it to you because the press made a very big deal about phase out versus phase down, but it's actually more nuanced than, are we agreeing to phase out or phase down? It's kind of convoluted language. But basically it says that the COP, right, the parties are calling upon parties to accelerate the development, deployment, and dissemination of technologies and the adoption of policies to transition towards low emission energy systems, including by rapidly scaling up the deployment of clean power generation and energy efficiency measures, including accelerating efforts towards the phase down, which was phase out, of unabated coal power, and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. So you see that it's not a very straightforward paragraph. It almost
was impossible over that one little word.
Yeah. So, and the other thing about it is, when a final text comes out, some of it has been previewed with certain parties. It all depends on the presidency, right? Sometimes the presidency will like widely share the document and get reactions to it so that they're not surprises, and so they can tinker around with provisions that raise problems. Sometimes they take their chances and flag certain provisions for certain countries, but not other ones, because they want to, they think they're at the exact place where a country is not going to object, and so they basically take a risk because they don't want to water it down. They don't want to find out in advance that someone would be against it. So presidencies have to play this pretty carefully, I would say. I don't know the facts on whether that paragraph was shared with China and India. I just don't know. Overnight, the presidency did hold consultations with various countries and share certain things. But I don't know if this provision, when you talk to China and India, they said that they had not seen this paragraph before and were surprised and would have, objected. I don't know what actually transpired, but they seemed pretty surprised by the word phase out in that paragraph. India had a slightly, different and additional point in the section on fossil fuel subsidies at the very end of this paragraph, and they wanted to add language in there which said, there was a positive reference to getting rid of phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and they wanted to add language which got added, which said, while providing targeted support to the poorest and most vulnerable. Okay, so there it wasn't a problem with talking about a phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, but they wanted the additional nuance of doing it in a particular way. So there were actually two different issues going on in that paragraph, just to be clear. So, what happened, maybe just to finish one more point, is that a lot of, or I don't know about a lot, but several countries had said, we don't love this outcome, this Glasgow Climate Pact, in every single detail, and we would want to change this or that, but for the greater good, we will kind of refrain from doing that. So there was a little bit of suggestion of unfairness at the end, right? Because when these changes were made for two countries, essentially they were, privileged to get their changes in, while other countries were not. So what happened was, after these changes were proposed, the president, the UK, basically had to touch base with a lot of these other countries and groups to make sure that they were going to be okay with going forward. Because if you brought these changes to the floor, to the plenary, and it resulted in other countries saying, oh, I was okay with not complaining 20 minutes ago, but now I'm not because other people got their changes, well, then the whole thing would have just fallen apart. So the UK basically had to assure itself that with those changes, it wasn't going to like completely upset the apple cart, which they did. And you ended up having, kind of a smooth adoption.
Well, I mean, the most vulnerable countries certainly saw the changes made in Glasgow as a real blow. Throughout, and just, for the audience and for those who are unfamiliar with this, the poorest and most vulnerable countries have long sought something that in UN parlance is called loss and damage, aid and assistance for the climate impacts that they can't adapt to, which are happening right now. Why is it so hard for these countries to get the climate justice they deserve?
Well, I don't know if you're asking the question about what was the deal in Paris. Maybe you are, but in the deal in Paris.
So, I mean, if we could, at every juncture, the most vulnerable countries, are set back. Here in Glasgow, they saw China and India push through language to phase down rather than phase out, while they were hoping for and did not get further on their issues of protecting their countries. Why is this so difficult, and why is it so difficult for wealthy countries to come to an agreement with the most vulnerable nations on how to protect them right now?
Yeah, I guess I don't see it that way.
Okay.
In the Paris Agreement, there was a push from the vulnerable countries to include an article on loss and damage. That was accepted. I mean, there was a big negotiation about it, but essentially the climate regime had not really addressed that in an agreement. There had been the creation of this Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage. Vulnerable countries wanted it highlighted and included in the Paris Agreement itself, which it was. Okay. Then in Madrid, there was a creation of, I know it sounds funny, but the Chile COP was actually hosted in Madrid because of social unrest in Chile. So they ended up with something called the Santiago Network on loss and damage. And that was an additional step towards helping vulnerable countries and basically creating kind of a network where they could get in touch with the various institutions in the world that are dealing with aspects of loss and damage. And that was supposed to be operationalized at Glasgow, which actually did happen. Then there was a move to create there was an additional request at the very last minute, actually, maybe 48 hours before the end of the COP, a request from the small islands to create a new fund for loss and damage. That took everyone by surprise. That was not really on the agenda. In my view, it would have been irresponsible for me as a negotiator to agree to a loss and damage fund without having laid the groundwork at all within our government and to see whether Congress would be in a position to fund something called a loss and damage fund. So I don't, I don't
You think of it at this stage.
I don't
come up.
No,
again.
but so the thing that did come out of Glasgow was not only this operationalization of Santiago and a call for funding of that Santiago network, but also agreement to host maybe 3 or 4 years of dialogues on the loss and damage issue beginning this June. So I would say that vulnerable countries got actually more out of Glasgow than was on the agenda of the meeting. And as we said in the plenary, we intend to participate in that set of dialogues in good faith and try to figure out if there are ways to deal with the loss and damage issue. If it's framed as compensation for emissions being emitted into the air and it's a developed country thing, which is how some frame it, we would absolutely not agree with that.
Can you explain why?
Well, because we don't accept that there is liability and compensation, and that was negotiated in Paris and made very clear in the Paris outcome that the regime is not about that. And even if you were to go down that road, there's no reason why it would be limited to developed countries as opposed to, emitting countries. China is the largest emitter in the world. Many countries have profited a lot from the export of fossil fuels. So, even if you were to go down the road of sort of liability and compensation, it would be a very different and complicated exercise to, apportion it. But anyway, yeah. So that would be my view.
Is a fund something that the U.S. could support?
Well, it all depends. I mean, I'm not going to answer that question in a vacuum. There are funds and there are funds. So.
And just to pause and let folks know that 10-15 minutes before the end, I'll open this up to questions. I'll ask folks to put their questions in the chat, and I'll read them from there. And you're welcome to start doing that at any time. And if things come up as we're speaking that are relevant, I'll add them in. So the goal of Glasgow and the negotiations are to get countries on a path to keep global temperature rise from surpassing 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. What's your level of confidence that we are going to stay within the 1.5 limit?
Well, it's, I can't predict where we're going to be. I mean, all I can tell you is we're doing everything possible as a government to try to stay within that limit. That's been the overarching goal of U.S. climate diplomacy over the last year, and it's going to be, the goal this year also. It takes so many different forms. I mean, basically, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, we've been concentrating on the major economies, given their contribution to emissions. So that's top priority is sort of working with the X number of countries that have not yet aligned their NDCs, their Paris NDCs, with the 1.5. I guess you could call it imperative, the 1.5 imperative. One of the we were talking about good things that came out of Glasgow before, and I gave you kind of an overview, but if you want to get more specific about it, I mean, one of the provisions that we think was very significant, and I've sort of tabbed it here, so let me see if I can actually find it. And for people interested, this is paragraph 29. And it basically says that the COP, or the parties to the Paris Agreement, request parties, and that means parties to Paris, to revisit and strengthen the 2030 targets in their nationally determined contributions as necessary to align with the Paris Agreement temperature goal by the end of 2022. And that was one of the provisions that sort of shocked me that it stayed in. I mean, I worked to keep it in, as did many others, but I was surprised that it actually stayed in. I thought some of the countries whose NDCs are not yet aligned with the Paris temperature goal would have fought, to take that out. So, but it's very relevant to your question, right? Because it actually provides a hook in the Glasgow outcome to keep the pressure on countries whose NDCs are not yet aligned with Paris. And whether you define the Paris temperature goal as, well below 2 or well below 2 and pursuing efforts to 1.5 or 1.5, they all would push in the direction of several countries not having yet done that. So that is a top goal for this year. But I want to mention one other thing that we're working on that's very relevant to this 1.5 issue, and that's the global methane pledge. One of the things that the U.S. I guess concocted, that sounds negative, the U.S. initiated with the EU last September kind of ish, was this idea of getting a bunch of countries together to support a global emissions goal, right? So we did not get into the detail of like who exactly is going to do what, but the point was, hey, everybody, let's like sign on to this concept of a global goal of reducing methane emissions by 30% by 2030, below 2020 levels, and then, we'll figure out sort of work on implementation and all that. And I don't think we would have believed it in September if someone had said by the time you leave the COP, there are going to be 110 countries signed up. Now, if fully implemented, this could result in, and I'm no expert on this, but I believe something like 0.2 degrees avoided warming, which, might sound tiny and insignificant if you don't follow this issue. But if you do, you know that that's like a really big deal. So one of the other, I would say, priorities for this year is actually getting implementation going with individual countries and groups of countries, and philanthropies have put in significant amounts of money to help get this thing going. So there's really a lot going on the kind of the 1.5 train, both bilaterally, multilaterally, private sector, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, and just to put the 0.2 in perspective for folks who don't follow this closely, scientists say we've already reached about 1.1 degrees Celsius rise from pre-industrial levels, and we're trying to keep below keep to the 1.5 limit. So in that context, 0.2 is certainly a big deal. I'd like to go back to the point you mentioned before, one of the heart of the Glasgow agreement, in which countries agreed to boost their ambition before this next COP in Egypt. I mean, it's interesting that you say countries didn't fight it, but we're also not seeing a lot of countries saying, doesn't apply to me. Pretty much the evening of the agreement, John Kerry, the special envoy for climate change, said this is not language that applies to the United States. We already have a strong target. We've heard something similar from the EU. We've heard something similar from Canada. We've even heard from Australia, which certainly does not have a strong target that's in line with 1.5, that they don't intend to go further, and that this doesn't apply to them. So what kind of teeth does this provision have? And is it really a success if you're starting to see countries say, not us?
I don't think countries are saying, well, I can't speak for other countries, but to the extent that people from the US have said this provision doesn't apply to us, I think what they mean is not this provision doesn't, it only applies to certain countries. I think what they're saying is, because the language of the provision is countries are requested to basically strengthen their NDCs as necessary to align, I think they're probably saying it is not necessary for us to change our NDC to align with Paris because our NDC is already aligned. So I think that's probably what they mean. But I would say, global increase of ambition is still a top priority, and the US is always looking for ways to increase its own and everyone else's ambition. So I wouldn't sort of make this like the litmus test. Does this provision apply or not? Also, the point of the provision was not to apply to the United States and the EU. I mean, I would say that the whole goal of 2021 was to get the major economies, all of them, really. I mean, we tried to do this in the G7 first, then the G20 in the major economies forum process, bilaterally, et cetera, trying to get all the major economies to upgrade their NDCs in a, Paris-aligned manner, if you want to call it that, before the COP or by the COP. And I think what we were worried about, we, and not only we, but many others, we wanted to make sure that, to the extent countries didn't do that, that the issue wasn't just forgotten, right? We didn't want a situation where, oh, if you don't do it by Glasgow, then, you're off the hook. We wanted to make sure that the pressure continued so that if a country hadn't done it by Glasgow, okay, then in a way you could look at it as an extension, if you want to think about it that way. You didn't do it by Glasgow, but you better do it in 2022. So that's the way I would look at it, not like, oh, people are trying to get out of something. No, this was intended to apply to the countries that didn't do what they were supposed to do in 2021. I would also say that,
can I just ask, sorry, and maybe I should know this, and I'm sorry, but what metric do countries use to decide whether they are in line with 1.5 or not? Is there an established, I know Climate Action Tracker, an NGO, does a lot of this work. Who says, obviously there's many countries that think the US should have a stronger target than the target that President Biden has set out, which is drawing down US emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. Oh, did I say it right? By 2030?
Yeah, in 2030. Yeah.
In 2030. Right. I mean, I've written it so many times. Can't believe it. But so who decides whether that's a target that's in line with 1.5 or not? And how do you decide?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not an exact science, I guess. And there is no, of course, objective decision maker in this process. There's no judge and jury to say, and that's the whole, the premise of Paris is basically nationally determined contributions. So you're going to have some wiggle room at the edges. But I would say it's easy to say that certain NDCs are nowhere close to being aligned with the Paris goal, even if it's hard to say which ones are exactly aligned with the Paris goal. Also note that it says Paris goal, right? Not 1.5. I think we would like to interpret it to be closer to 1.5 than well below 2, but I'd like to be honest about what things say. So I want to just make that clear. So I would give China as an example. I mean, China gave, and at one point, when I think about sort of COP26 disappointments as opposed to good things that came out, I would say that, we probably said that was a disappointment. And I think many would agree with that.
Could you be a little more specific? What about China?
Yeah. So, I mean, President Xi did announce in, I think, December of 2020, if I'm remembering correctly, on the 5th anniversary of the adoption of the Paris Agreement, there was a big kind of event that the U.S. was not really part of because it was the very end of the Trump administration. But at that event, President Xi said that they would make 4 changes to the 4 elements of their NDC. And, on the one that was related to CO2 and 2030, which was, carbon peaking, it basically changed from carbon peaking around 2030, which is language I was very familiar with because we did the joint, I worked on the joint announcement with China in 2014, and that's the first time that emerged. They changed that to, I'm not sure if in Chinese it's by 2030 or before 2030, but basically went from around 2030 to, before or by 2030, which most, observers would say, well, that was not at all, so, that was not at all enough in terms of the Paris temperature goal, and not even enough to meet China's own carbon neutrality goal of carbon neutrality by 2060. In other words, if you had kind of a plateau during the 2030s and you didn't peak till the very end of until the very end of the 2020s, it would require an incredibly steep dive to get to carbon neutrality by 2060. So, we would have liked to see, something much more ambitious on CO2 during the 2020s incorporated into the NDC. But basically what they incorporated into the NDC was more kind of incremental changes, including this, difference between around and by or before.
It's always fascinating how much climate diplomacy depends on these little words, by, before, semicolons and should or shall. Before we get to questions, let's stay on China for a moment. Tell me a little bit about, so the US and China came out with a joint statement in Glasgow. It gave a little bit of energy at a time of consternation at the talks. Tell us what's been happening since, and how confident are you that China will be in a position to put forward really a truly more ambitious target before the next COP?
Let me go back a little bit just to put the joint declaration from Glasgow in context, just maybe for a minute. We did spend a lot of last year working bilaterally with China on, a whole range of climate-related issues. We issued our first joint statement last April, where we agreed to do certain things together. We were both going to put out our long-term strategy or update our long-term strategies by the COP. In other words, our 2050, or in their case, 2060, long-term strategies. And a couple other things we agreed to both do. And then we laid out maybe 8 issues that we would continue discussing. And so we did spend all of last summer discussing, and all of the fall discussing, trying to figure out, could we reach further agreement on any of these things? And it was, it was a tough slog. There was a lot of technical work that was that went into it, and more, a lot of like political and policy work. We also talked quite a bit about what the outcome of the COP should be, trying to see if we could help. We've have a tradition of trying to reach agreement between ourselves on certain COP issues, which then can facilitate global agreement. So this thing that ended up finishing almost by, I wouldn't say exactly by accident, but it would, the timing was, I think, fortuitous that we happened to reach agreement right in the middle of a bit of a lull the second week. But this joint declaration had a section on the COP. Now that's kind of, as we call it, OBE at this point, right? Overtaken by events, because the COP is now over. But at the time, I think it had, a bit of a good impact. The other things that were in there that are of significance are Chinese commitments to develop a national action plan on methane in 2022. So that's this year. To accelerate their coal consumption phase down. They've already, committed to, in their 15th five-year plan, to begin the acceleration, or to begin the phase down. And what we were looking for was like to make that accelerated. The third was that we both have laws that relate to, anti-deforestation, if you want to call it that, and that we would work together to effectively enforce those laws, and that we would, as an institutional matter, set up a working group to carry out cooperation. And we haven't yet met. The Chinese were in quarantine for 21 days plus 7 days. I mean, very different from how we came back from the COP and went back to our, kind of daily lives. So we are set to meet again after Chinese New Year, which is, as Jeff said, beginning this week. So we will be setting up a working group to go through all of.
When is the next meeting with the Chinese?
Well, we don't have a date, but it's going to be after. It's going to be in February, where we're going to establish or get the working group going. But in the meantime, China's already working on the things that we agreed to. It's kind of unleashed. I call it a kind of a force multiplier. These commitments that we agreed to bilaterally, because they have a tendency of getting the work going domestically in China by virtue of just existing, which is a good thing. So those are things we're concentrating on with China bilaterally. Of course, we continue to think that they should upgrade their NDC, but that's not specifically mentioned in our joint declaration.
Gotcha. I'm turning to the chat, and we have so many questions, and I'm going to start a little early because folks have great things to say and ask. We have a couple questions on loss and damage. One from Joe Thwaites. What about a loss and damage arrangement where all countries are liable to contribute based on the cumulative contribution to the problem? Is something like that, has that been discussed? Is that an acceptable possibility?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to say anything more about that topic, and I'd rather address other topics. We're considering issues. I've said that we're not going to go down the road of liability and compensation, and that's what I'm going to say. Let's get, oh my gosh, how do I do this? There's one more that I do want to at least get on the table, and if not something you want to see. I'm just having a little trouble scrolling up. There we go. Well, since I'm a Luddite who can't seem to scroll, I'll ask another question first. Jason Funk asks, from the outside, we're talking about Glasgow here, the Glasgow COP. From the outside, it looked like there was quite a bit of, he calls it churn, right up into the end of this COP. That is, there were still novel ideas about Article 6 being introduced even 24 hours before the closing plenary. In the end, many of those things were dropped. But what does this reflect, if anything, about the COP process?
and the durability. And I think there's a lot of interesting things there. I mean, well, if you speak to that, and I might have a follow-up on where we go from here in this process.
Yeah. Last minute churn doesn't bother me at all. To me, that's like completely normal. Sometimes, you know how they say like necessity is the mother of invention. I do think a lot of ideas come out at the end because people are thinking like, wait a minute, we might not reach agreement. Let's think, is there a way to bridge the gap between X and Y? Or how about if we do X here, could we do Y there? Or, I think it gets people's brains running on overtime, and a lot of good ideas come out at the end. Also, sometimes countries hang on to their positions until the last second or whatever. So often these ideas don't emerge until the last minute, not because of, churn exactly, but just because, that's kind of the if the COP were a week long, these ideas would emerge at the end of week one. If it were 3 weeks long, they would, emerge at the end of 3 weeks. So I just think that's kind of the nature of the beast. What I was going to say about, I don't know, Lisa, if I can take the opportunity of talking about COPs to say that I think that the next COP might be interesting, for the reason that there's not really much on the agenda to be, finished at COP27. In the past, I sort of wrote an article called something like "Wither the COP" with the H in brackets, right? Because what I was starting to think about after Madrid was, well, what does the COP do when it's no longer really in the mode of negotiations as much as it has in the past been, in the past, we've always been at some stage of a negotiation of something or other, even if it was like year 2 of a 4-year process, you were still like trying to develop X agreement, or you were trying to negotiate the rules under a particular agreement. Now we have an agreement that's mostly nationally determined, right? So every X years, countries will be coming forward with their own, designed commitments. And yes, there'll be some negotiation always, but, largely the design has been carried out. And, I think you may see that in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the question is then, what's the best use of a COP? I mean, you have a gathering of the whole world, not only governments, but civil society and a lot of actors that have taken on commitments. There, in the past, we see more and more activity on the sides of the, the COP as event, as opposed to the COP as institution. And, maybe the emphasis will switch to that, and maybe that will be good. Maybe the focus will be much more on sort of constructive initiatives than on, the negotiating churn. I don't know. As a negotiator, it's not as exciting for me, but sorry.
Do you think it needs to stay in this process? Like, do we need a COP 40, 50, 60?
I don't know about 40 and 50 and 60. I mean, people have talked over the years about, do we really need an annual COP? And because every year, it puts the host country will always want some, no host country wants to preside over a boring COP, right? So there'll always be initiatives, and at even a year where you want to focus on implementation, no minister thinks that implementation is, that the I word tends to put people to sleep, even though it's the most important thing, of course. But then you'll always get pushback from those who say, but these COPs keep the pressure on, and you get deliverables at these COPs because they exist. So it's actually a good thing. You could even argue that the Framework Convention, it doesn't have much content to it. I'm talking about the original Framework Treaty. It's all about take appropriate measures to do this and that, not very specific. But you could say the most important aspect of the treaty was setting up this annual COP, which, although some may say it hasn't achieved enough, it's certainly gotten countries and non-state actors to do probably much more than they would have done in the absence of an annual COP where they were expected to come and deliver something. So I don't think the COP's going to go away anytime soon, even if there might be rational arguments for, but it will need to be maybe reconceptualized.
We have a question from Zach Coleman. He writes, the administration has put a lot of stock in the commitments announced by the Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero. What level of confidence do you have that the public can effectively police private financial institutions for meeting those net zero and investment goals?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really an expert in that. I do know that one of the interesting initiatives is a UN Secretary General initiative that was announced at COP26, where they're going to pull together experts to try to look into this exact issue of like net zero goals taken on by financial institutions and corporations, et cetera, private sector, and try to come up with some criteria by which to judge those kinds of net zero goals. So that, because right now there are all kinds of different standards. And so the idea is let's pull together kind of best practices, best thinking on how to evaluate and, make them, I guess the best word would be credible, to make them credible. So that's something we're paying, a lot of attention to. You've also got the climate champions as part of the Paris process, doing the same kind of thing, trying to kind of impose or whatever, propose rigor into these, the abundance of net zero goals that are being taken on by non-state actors.
Stephen Locascio asks, is there a schedule of penalties for the countries that don't meet their NDCs, their nationally determined commitments, climate targets? I mean, if you could answer, I think the answer is no, but talk a little bit as well about, is there any appetite in the US, do you think, to do a legally binding agreement?
Well, the answer under the Paris Agreement is it all depends what you mean by a penalty. In the sense of like a financial penalty or a trade sanction, obviously no. You wouldn't have a Paris Agreement if that was part of it, or at least you wouldn't have a Paris Agreement with global participation, and you would probably, even if you had widespread participation, probably the ambition level of the NDCs would be much more cautious, right? Because countries would be worried about exceeding their targets and being subject. I mean, you have to look at all of these provisions as related to each other. You can't kind of look at Paris and say, I like the participation level and I like the NDCs, now let's just make them subject to some kind of punitive consequence if you don't meet them. Obviously that would like change the entire dynamic of the agreement. That doesn't mean that there isn't a system in the Paris Agreement for what you could call accountability, even though it's not binding consequences. I mean, that's what the whole transparency regime is essentially about. The transparency regime under Paris is all about having to report on not only your emissions, but how you are doing. It's called tracking progress. How you are doing.
But we saw that flouted during the Trump administration. What were the consequences?
Well, it wasn't, I mean, the Trump administration pulled out of the agreement. So that was a little bit of a different
but also
story.
Didn't do the reporting, the biannual, the reports that were required. Maybe I'm misstating it, but
absolutely. Yes, they did not hand in the reports, which this administration has made up for. But what I'm trying to say is that the purpose of these tracking progress is to see whether you are meeting your NDC. Obviously, if a country doesn't put in its reporting at all, you can't judge that. But the world is going to judge. I mean, this is what outside groups, first of all, other countries and outside groups follow this kind of thing very, very closely. So, accountability is the job of many, many different, parts of the system, which includes outside groups, think tanks, trackers, the press, countries. And the Paris Agreement contains a system that can give you, insight into whether countries are meeting their targets or not, with a sort of, as they say, a name and shame kind of approach. So, do I think like that's the best system in the world? Well, I can't say that. I'm just like I helped design these agreements, and all I can tell you is that there's a, interrelationship among all these different factors. And if you make this one too strong, you kind of upset things in the opposite direction. So, I have not, in my experience with the climate regime, seen a scenario where you can get all the major economies in with binding targets, with severe consequences, and a high ambition level. I think that's like the Easter Bunny in the sense that it doesn't exist.
Great. Jeffrey Wang has a question about the $100 billion. So this is a promise that countries made now in Cancun to mobilize $100 billion in public and private finance to help developing countries both transition to clean energy and cope with the consequences of climate change. It hasn't been met. Jeffrey asks, why is the $100 billion a year to the poorest countries promised and then broken? If these international climate funds are difficult to receive, if it's difficult to receive support from the U.S. government, then what do you think is the best way for the poorest nations to adapt to climate change and transition to renewable energy development in the most equitable way?
Yes, there was a mobilization goal taken on first in Copenhagen, repeated in Cancun, and then extended in Paris. It went up to, it was basically a 2020 goal initially. And in Paris, it was extended through 2025. So that's what we're talking about for people who don't know about this mobilization goal. Yeah, it was a major issue last year that the developed countries, which were the ones on the hook to do the mobilizing, were not on track yet. I mean, not likely to meet it in 2020, although the data wasn't in yet, but they were sort of basing that on 2019 data. And a lot of effort was put into getting as close as possible last year. So I don't want that to be, go unnoticed. And the U.S. put a lot of effort into that, not only in terms of raising its own commitments, but running around and trying to get others to raise theirs as well. So we may be in a position to be able to implement the 100 this year. We are working on that. Which would be, yes, 2 years late. But as we were saying last year, it's not, we didn't accept that this is sort of failure, which is what many were calling it. We said if you got we were on track to meet 98 in, I believe, this year. 98 is not failure. Like in most places, that would be an A+. So, we sort of rejected that kind of commentary on it, while saying also that we need to meet it as quickly as possible. The other thing the U.S. did is, speaking of vulnerable countries, is make its first ever contribution to the Adaptation Fund. This was at COP26. It's a fund that vulnerable countries like. It's true that the Green Climate Fund also gives money not only to mitigation but to adaptation, but there's a kind of a particular fondness for the Adaptation Fund. So that was something else that we did. And of course, the president announced this new initiative, a U.S. initiative called Prepare, which is also focused on adaptation and vulnerable countries. So I think a lot is going on, and we shouldn't just look at the 100 as the sole test of where the donors are. And
as you mentioned, President Biden announced $11.4 billion annual international climate finance by 2024. Zach Coleman asks, if that's enough. A lot of analysis has shown, he says, that figure is far below the U.S. fair share. And also, President Biden has had trouble passing big portions of his climate agenda. Is the U.S. doing enough, and what kind of reaction are you getting from the international community about what we're doing and what we're failing to do?
Well, I would say the international community is still very positive about the United States. Now that may change at some point if the U.S. is not able to sort of deliver on its commitments. But I would say that the international community is, pleased that the Biden administration has made climate change such a high priority in terms of both. Well, I shouldn't say both. In terms of funding commitments, 50 to 52%. NDC, all the initiatives that we've engaged in, the fact that it's really a whole of government approach. And I think that was really in evidence at the COP. There were maybe 10 cabinet members and heads of agency there, and in part to show it's an all of government exercise. So I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for the administration and its approach. Do they wish there were more? Maybe, but the vibe that we get is largely, very positive and kind of appreciative of the role that the U.S. and John Kerry in particular has been playing in this field.
Beyond the attention and focus on climate change in the administration, the guts of the U.S. effort to meet the 50 to 52% target is in the Build Back Better Act, which, as everyone likely knows, is stalled in Congress. What are the consequences internationally if the U.S. cannot pass this legislation?
Well, we're obviously trying to get other countries to implement their NDCs and enhance them where they're not yet Paris aligned, which is what I said a few minutes ago. So the more we can do to show that we're on track to deliver ours, the better off we are, of course, right? As a matter of diplomacy, you're in a much better or stronger position to get others to do more if you can show that you're doing more. So, is it fatal if we don't get a particular version of Build Back Better? I don't know. I think there are probably many. I'm not like the expert on domestically how we meet 50 to 52. I'm told there are many pathways to 50%. Obviously, the more we can show that we are on track to get to 50 by 2030, the stronger position we're in internationally to get others to do more. And we're sort of couching the year of 2022 as implementation plus. I don't know whether I mentioned that expression earlier, but we're trying to. Some countries have said this is the year of implementation, right? Because we have the goals on the table. We have a lot of commitments. We have a lot of goals. Now we need to transition to actually getting them implemented. And I guess we would just sort of raise, see you and raise you one, say yes, it's all about implementation, but the goals and commitments on the table are not actually enough. So we need to add plus. So let me just give a couple concrete examples of that. The NDCs that are on the table, they need to be implemented. So we absolutely can't just be happy because they exist on paper. We have to get them, into domestic policy and law and all of that. But as I mentioned before, some of the NDCs are not ambitious enough. So that's kind of in the plus column, if that makes sense, right? There, it's not a matter of pure implementation. It's a matter of actually taking on a higher target. So another example would be the 100 billion, which was just asked about. The 100 billion needs to be implemented as quickly as possible. But the plus is that you're not going to get to 1.5 through the billions. You need to align the trillions. You need to Paris align, as they say, the trillions. So that's something that people need to work on more this year. We started decarbonizing various sectors, over the last few years, and there were various declarations and initiatives at COP26, like for example on shipping decarbonization. We need to hit other sectors with decarbonization initiatives. ICAO is doing some, IMO is doing some. We're working with our First Movers Coalition to get the private sector to go even further. So that's probably in the plus column. So I only mention that because the more we're in a position to show that we're implementing, we're obviously on firmer ground to be able to push others to both implement and go further.
We're just at 1:30, but I'm going to close us out with one last question from the chat, which I think is a great one. If parties could, of all the things that you just mentioned, if parties could accomplish one goal at the next COP, what would you like to see it be?
Well, that's an interesting one. I think I've been convinced by people who are whose knowledge is far superior to mine that we should be focusing on what they call fast mitigation. That this decade is one of accelerated action, and we should be focusing on methane and other short-lived climate pollutants. And maybe a great outcome where we're planning to have a ministerial meeting of the global methane pledge countries, if we could get all the key countries into that and actually implementing at the domestic level, that would be a fantastic COP27 outcome.
Right. Sue, it has been such a pleasure speaking with you. I want to thank everyone who's on the webinar, and really thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks everybody who tuned in. Until next time.